Knights, castles, horses, inventions, medieval towns, medieval marketplace, Vikings, Huns, etc. These are a part of a period called the medieval period or the Middle Ages or even the Dark Ages. You've seen these things in so many movies, cartoons, stories, and so many important stories, events, and wars associated with this period. And many of us don't know much about this period. It brought a lot of drastic changes to society, whether good or bad. It is a really important and historical period in history. Without further ado, I present you everything you need to know about this important period in history. The Middle Ages started in the 5th and ended in the 15th century. It lasted for about 1,000 years. What is the Middle Ages exactly? It is a very important period in European history that had many important events. Some of them are the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 AD, the Treaty of Verdun, 843 AD, the Ottonian Holy Roman Empire of Germany, 962 AD, the Battle of Hastings, 1066 AD, the Great Famine, 1315 to 1317 AD, the Hundred Years' War, 1337 AD, the Black Death, 1348 to 1350 AD, the Great Schism, 1378 to 1417 AD. A few important events took place after the end of the Middle Ages. Some of them were the Renaissance, 1300 to 1600, the Age of Enlightenment, 17th to 19th century. Why was it called the Middle Ages? It was called the Middle Ages as it was the time between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the early modern Europe. It is called the Dark Ages as not much is known about this period to the historians, hence proving it dark to historians. The significant number of unfortunate events that happened during this period may also be the reason why it's called the Dark Ages. Okay, so how did it begin? You see, Rome was at the pinnacle of power in the 2nd century around the year 117 AD under the rule of the Roman Emperor Trajan. Almost all of the coastline along the Mediterranean Sea was a part of the Roman Empire. The places were Spain, Italy, France, Southern Britain, Turkey, Israel, Egypt and Northern Africa. But then the Roman Empire divided into two, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. But actually for the next 100 years or so, it had been reunited, then split into three, then two, then finally had been split into two permanently. The Western Empire was ruled by Rome. It was in the city of Milan. Then the Eastern Empire was ruled by Constantinople, and the Eastern Empire was called Byzantium, later called Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire fell first, and the Eastern 1,000 years later, before being conquered by the Ottoman Empire in the 1400s. And finally in 476 AD, Odoacer, a German barbarian, took control of Rome. He became king of Italy and forced the last emperor of Rome, Romulus Augustulus, to give up his crown. This was the end of the Roman Empire. There were many other reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire, which were invasions by barbarian tribes, economic troubles, the size of the empire made it difficult to govern, the arrival of the Huns and the migration of the barbarian tribes, weakening of the Roman legions, fighting within themselves and civil wars within the empire. The Roman Empire was no longer a dominant force, and corruption. People were actually happy that the Roman Empire fell due to the cruelty and heavy taxes imposed upon them. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages had started. So what happened after this? You see, after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was a lot of chaos and confusion, as most of Europe was ruled by Rome. Many rulers and kings tried to grab power, Here's a brief overview on the Middle Ages before we begin with the events that took place. The Middle Ages was divided into three parts: early, high, and the late Middle Ages. Many things happened in the early Middle Ages. Things like population decline, counter-urbanization, collapse of the centralized authority, invasion and mass migrations of tribes. There were many political and social changes in society when the Roman Empire fell. During this period, there were many invasions by people, but they were not just military expeditions, but migrations of many people into the empire. Such movements were successful as the Western Roman Empire refused to support the army or pay the taxes that would have allowed the military to suppress the migration. This was the migration period. Many of the migration were movements of Germanic, Hunnic, Slavic, and other people into the territory of the then declining Roman Empire, with or without accompanying invasions or war. This formed many new kingdoms. Almost all of the scholarly written culture of the new kingdoms was also based on the Roman culture and traditions. A gradual loss of tax revenue by the new policies caused the taxation systems to decay. Warfare was common between the kingdoms. Slavery declined as the supply was weakened and the society of Europe became more rural. The High Middle Ages were a period during 1000 and 1300. During this period, the population increased exponentially. The approximate population of Europe grew from 35 to 80 million. The reasons may have been improvement in agricultural techniques, the decline of slavery, a more suitable climate, and the decline of invasions. The sudden population increase had greatly benefited the economy of Europe. The Vikings had started settling in the British Isles, France, and other places. During this period, a lot of intellectual, spiritual, and artistic works were made. During most of this period, Constantinople was the populated city in Europe, and the Byzantium art reached its peak. Architecture-wise, most of the notable, remarkable Gothic cathedrals were finished around this period. It ended when the crisis of the late Middle Ages began. The late Middle Ages was a period of European history lasting from 1250 to 1500 AD. After the late Middle Ages, the early modern Europe started. In the late Middle Ages, the prosperous growth of Europe had stopped as few plagues and famines had come, which were the Great Famine and the Black Death. The 100 Years' War was fought in this period. You might be thinking, wow, that's a lot of problems. There surely can't be more. Well, surprise, on top of all of that, France and England had experienced very large peasant uprisings, which were the Jacquard and the Peasants' Revolt. And during this period, the unity of the Catholic Church was temporarily shattered by the Western Schism. This caused great social unrest, and all of these events together were known as the crisis of the late Middle Ages. Apart from all these problems, this period saw a vast improvement in arts and science. The Ottoman Empire had also conquered the Eastern Roman Empire during this period. This period was the end of the Middle Ages. The society or the feudal system during the Middle Ages worked something like this. The feudal system was based around the lord and the manor. The lord owned the land and would keep the peasants safe in return of their service to him. And the lord would then have to provide the king with soldiers or taxes. The land the lord owned was called the manor. There was a small village and a local church around the castle where the lord lived. People would gather here for protection or celebrations. Farms were spread there for the peasants to work in. The manor was the center of the life in the Middle Ages. Now you might be wondering how the social system was. There was a fixed structure in society during the Middle Ages. You were born in a class of people and you stayed in the same class for the rest of your life. You could not change your status. The clothing, food, house was already decided according to your social status or class. Feudalism followed a hierarchical order, and at the top was the king who owned the land. He couldn't control it all by himself, so it was divided among the barons, and the barons gave their loyalty and soldiers to the king in return. Then came the bishop, who was the top church leader in the kingdom, and he managed an area called a diocese, which was the district under his care. The Catholic Church had a lot of power and control, and this made the bishop powerful. The church received a tithe of 10% from the annual produce or the earnings of all the people, which made some bishops very rich as well. After that were the barons and the nobles, who ruled large areas of land called fiefs, which were given by the king. They then again divided their land among people known as lords, who ran manors, which were already explained. Their task was to basically own an army that would always be ready for the king's use. What happens if they do not have an army? If they did not have an army, then they would have to pay a tax to the king, known as the shield tax. Under the barons and the nobles were the lords and the knights, we already know. The lords were the people who ran the manors. The knights were basically heavily armored soldiers that were an important part of the army and could be called into battle at any time by the baron. Now, at the next were the peasants and the serfs. At the lowest level were the peasants or serfs, and the majority of population were peasants. They had a very hard life, and most died before they were the age of 30 years old. Majority were slaves, and a few were considered free and had businesses. They barely had food to survive, which could be a reason for their early death. They also worked 6 days a week. The serfs were even below the peasants and were workers bound to a piece of land called fief and loyal to the lord or a noble. The difference between the peasants and the serfs was that the peasants were free to different fiefs or manors for work, but the serfs could not be bought or sold. Their life was too dull and hard. Now, you probably must be wondering how life was during the Middle Ages. To answer this question, I will put you in their shoes to get a better understanding of how life in the Middle Ages was. First, you would have to pass childhood, which was very difficult as many children died in infancy. If you survived, you would most probably be a farmer, as majority of the population is a farmer. And since you are a farmer, you would almost definitely live in a country, and you would work in the lord's manor or castle. You would be known as a villein by the lord, as peasants were known as villeins by the lord. You would grow crops like barley, wheat and oats and vegetables and fruits. You would also use cows for milk. You worked really hard every year for very little money, which would then be cut again for taxes, and you had to work for free many times. You would wake up for work as early as 3 a.m. You think you would at least live in a castle or something, but no, you would not live in a castle. You would live in a small 1 or 2 room house, which would then be very crowded, and your house would be brightened by. What about clothing? You would wear simple clothing made out of wool to keep you warm. Men would wear a tunic and wooden stockings and also a cloak. Women wore a long skirt called a kirtle and an apron, a woolen stocking and a cloak just like men. You had little gardens near your home which had a variety of vegetables, fruits and nuts. You would not attend school as it was for the wealthy and the rich, and you would learn necessary skills from your parents. Water was very unclean and impure at that time. You would usually go to festivals where people told stories, sang songs, danced, talked and just had entertainment. There were many holidays as well. The city life was difficult as well and was crowded too. The people who lived there were usually members of a guild, which is basically an association of people who looked over the practice of their particular crafts in an area. Their jobs were mainly related to craftsmanship, and many young boys would spend years learning a craft from a master craftsman. If somehow you were born as a noble, you would live a much luxurious life, have much more wide variety of food and drinks. Your clothes would be made from silk, velvet and damask. You would have servants and get education where you would learn things like reading, writing, logic, music, mathematics and public speaking, and would live in a castle. Your lifespan would be larger as well. Now we know there were knights during the Middle Ages, but do we know what exactly is a knight? A knight is a type of a soldier. They were covered with metal armor and rode on a horse, and they would basically use many weapons such as lance, sword, mace and longbows. There are 2 main types of armor, which were chainmail, which were made of thousands of metal rings, and the other type of armor which was known as plate armor, which offered better protection but was less flexible. The horses which knights used for wars were known as a destrier, and they too bore an armor for protection. Their job was to fight battles for their lord, who in turn battled for their king, for which they would get gifts of money, precious things and land. They had to also capture castles, which required them to use siege weapons like catapults and a ballista, which were used to throw rocks and break the walls and destroy structures. A battering ram, which was a log used to break down gates of a castle, and other siege weapons like a siege tower and a trebuchet. Now knights always didn't fight wars, right? Yes, they always didn't fight wars. Outside of wars, they had many duels, tournaments and jousting. They were mainly there to improve their skills and were done when there were no wars or when there was peace. Tournaments were a series of competitions in which knights took part when invited by a town or an area. It was usually fought between local knights and knights from other areas. These tournaments were really popular in the Middle Ages and were very entertaining to the people at that time. The tournaments were also known as tourneys and originated in France in about the middle of the 11th century. The judges of the tournaments were the nobles and the announcers were the heralds. The joust was a very popular main event. The tournaments were also known as mêlée, hastelude, tourney or tournoi, and its whole purpose was to show off and improve their military skills in games or activities like jousting or the mêlée and showcase their chivalry. There were many games, but mêlée and the jousting were the main attraction. The mêlée was basically a knight fighting one another, sometimes on foot or mounted on a horse, either divided by two sides or as a free-for-all, in which the main objective was to conquer or capture other knights and to hold them for ransom and freeing them for a price, and some knights became very rich after this. The next event was jousting, and it was one of the most important events in the competition, in which two knights would charge each other mounted on horses, each holding a lance. The objective was to charge each other and knock each other off their horse. The winners got fame and prize money. The knights had a code of chivalry which they tried to follow, and if they followed them completely, they were known as the ideal knight. The code of chivalry basically was a set of rules which told how a knight should behave. Another thing you may have noticed is that knights had painted symbols on their shields, their banners and the coat they wore above their armors. These symbols were there to distinguish one knight from another, as when they had full armor, no one could recognize them. This was called the knight's coat of arms. Each coat of arms had different colors and charges, which was the main figure in the coat of arms. These colors and charges signified different things like bravery, power, ambition, etc. It was the herald's job of keeping track of which coat of arms belonged to which knight. Since the arrival of the first knights in the 8th century during the reign of Charles Magny, it was pretty clear that knights were very popular during the Middle Ages and everyone wanted to be a knight. And I'm pretty sure even you would want to be a knight. Now, I will put you in the shoes of a person who went through the process of becoming a knight. First, you would have to be born to parents from the noble or any other rich class, or be the son of a knight itself. Why? Because to become a knight, you had to buy a knight's equipment, which is definitely not cheap. But if you want to be a knight, you have to start training from a young age, usually at the age of 7. Now that you are 7, you would probably be sent to a castle of another knight or lord. These people were most probably relatives or people whom your parents were loyal to. Now you would be given the title of a page and would be taken care by the lord who you live with now. Now it was time for training. You wouldn't be given difficult tasks. At first, you would learn things like hunting with other hunters and a bit of studies and knowledge taught by priests and chaplains. After a few years of doing that, you will start getting more responsibilities, such as being an assistant to a knight and assisting him in things like expeditions, wars, and taking care of his armors and horses. After a few years of doing such tasks, again you are taught things like swordsmanship, horse riding, combat, learning how to fight wars. Once you turned 15, you became to be known as a squire. The title squire came from the French word ecuyer, meaning shield bearer. Now you would wear your own armor and use real weapons. You had to keep on training real combat and were required to master different skills necessary for a knight, which became to be known as the 7 points of agility. They were respectively riding, swimming, diving, shooting different types of weapons, climbing, participating in tournaments, wrestling, fencing, long jumping and dancing, all this whilst wearing armor. And after a few years of doing this, when you became 21, you were finally going to be a knight. Now you will get the title of a knight at the dubbing ceremony. In the ceremony, you would be kneel before another knight, lord or king who would give the honor of making you a knight and was known as the dubber. You were finally knighted by a tap on the shoulders with a sword, as simple as that. Then you would have to take an oath of honor in which you basically vow to protect the king and the church. Now you were finally considered as a knight officially, and you were given a horse, shield and banner, and off you go, fulfilling the duties and responsibilities of a knight. And that's how you become a knight. A very hard journey indeed, in which not many succeed. Now, another famous thing we all know from the Middle Ages was the castle. At first, a castle was used for defense purposes. It was also used for offensive purposes. How? They were also used to set their bases in an enemy land, like this guy. Who was this guy? He was William the Conqueror. In 1066, this guy was leading the Norman invasion of England, and as he was invading England, he built many castles to protect the land he had took over so far, and that's how castles came to England. But you must be wondering how people started living there. Well, originally nobody lived in a castle, but then castles weren't useful for defensive and offensive purposes, as new weapons such as the cannon could easily destroy them and better fortifications were made, so it wasn't logical to use castles anymore. So instead people started living in them. Here are the important parts of a castle. The castle was surrounded by a ditch filled with water, which you always see in any castle picture. It is known as a moat and was used for defense. Then there was the drawbridge, which was a bridge over the moat, and as you can notice had chains attached to it which could raise it higher and lower. It led the way to the gatehouse, which was the entrance of the castle. Then what is that spiky thing over the gateway? That is the portcullis, a heavy spiked gateway that could be lowered to block passage into a gateway for people like attackers. Most of the time, two portcullises would be there for trapping them. Once trapped, people threw all sorts of things on them from the murder hole, which was at the ceiling of the gateway. Then at the center of the castle, you will find a smaller tower at the center of the castle known as a keep. It was usually where the owners lived. It was one of the strongest part of the castle, and if all else fails, they can continue to defend from the keep. Around the keep was a courtyard known as the bailey, and it was the residence of the rest of the people in the castle. The bailey was surrounded by a defensive wall known as curtain walls to protect the bailey. These high walls with gaps in between them are called battlements. The gaps were known as crenels and the high blocks were known as merlins. The gaps allowed the defenders to shoot or throw things at the attacker. Those gaps on curtain walls are known as arrow slits. Their primary purpose was to let archers shoot arrows through the opening. It was usually shaped like a cross. And that's all the most important things of the castle. Vikings. Who were they? Vikings were people from Scandinavia, which was in northern Europe. As you already know, they mainly used to raid and trade with many places in Europe and many other places. Another important thing was the Viking Age, which was in 1800 AD to 1066 AD. It was a very important period in history where they settled in many places other than their homeland. In their language, Old Norse, Vikings mean to raid, so that already explains a lot about them. The main ships the Viking used to use were known as the long ship. As the name suggests, they were all really long and narrow. This design allowed the ship to move with speed and agility. They too had oars and sails, the latter which made moving in wind easy. The Vikings always had armors and weapons with them. Vikings wore many different types of helmets, wore chainmail armor. They usually wore tunics and trousers. The Vikings used many weapons like bows, spears, swords, knives, axes and slings. They also used shields, but only the richest could afford to have all armors and weapons. So what happened in the Viking Age? The Viking Age began when the Vikings had attacked and destroyed a monastery in England and caused devastation there in 793. In the Viking Age, they basically began to raid and settle in many places like the Great Britain, Germany, Iceland, Russia and France, where they established Normandy. The Viking Age ended when the Viking raids had stopped. In the Battle of Stamford Bridge in the year 1066, this Norwegian king was killed when he was attempting to take a portion of England back. The Huns were nomadic warriors in the 4th and 5th century CE that were known for attacking Europe and were one of the main causes for the fall of the Roman Empire. They launched many invasions on the empire on tribes like the Alans, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. They were the new barbarians in the Roman Empire. They caused a lot of destruction in the Roman Empire and were known for being ruthless. The Huns tribes had finally united in 430 AD under King Rugila, who was one of the main reasons for the many of the Huns' victories over the Roman Empire. But after his death in 434, who succeeded him? He had two nephews, Attila and Bleda. Attila being the infamous leader of the Huns. He was the biggest enemy of the Western and Eastern Roman Empire. First, they invaded the cities along the Danube River, and in 441 AD they invaded the Balkans following a failed attempt of raiding Constantinople. He campaigned in Persia but failed miserably, but then was successful in invading the Eastern Roman Empire in 441, which made him want to invade the West but failed to the Battle of He then took but failed to take Rome. He was going to launch more attacks on the Romans but died in 453. In 459, the empire collapsed and was gone, and many Huns joined the civilizations and cultures they once ruled over, but they were well known throughout history. There were a lot of crusades in the Middle Ages. The crusades were religious wars that took place during the Middle Ages, where the Christians attempted to reclaim control of Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslims. Why? Jerusalem had a religious significance and was important to many religions. Crusades lasted for nearly 200 years. Now, another important thing that happened in Europe was the migration period that happened approximately in 300 to 700 CE, and it refers to the migration of the so-called barbarian tribes into the Roman Empire. The tribes that migrated in this period were the Huns, Goths, Vandals, Bulgars, Alans, Suebi, Frisians, Franks and many other tribes. That's why there were so many tribes in Europe in the Middle Ages. That's basically everything you need to know about the Middle Ages. Now let us see an overview of every important event in the Middle Ages. First important event in the Middle Ages was the fall of the Roman Empire, 476 AD, which basically started the Middle Ages. Then came the Battle of Tours, 732 AD, in which the Franks defeated the Islamic invaders and put a stop to their expansion. Then came the Treaty of Verdun, 843 AD, in which the Carolingian Empire was split into three parts in 843 AD through the Treaty of Verdun, which ended the 3 years long Carolingian Civil War. After that, in 835, Vikings started to invade northern Europe. Then came the Battle of Hastings, 1066 AD, in which William the Conqueror defeated King Harold II and became the King of England and brought significant changes to the country. In 1215 AD, King John of England had signed the Magna Carta. This document limited the power of the king and gave some rights to the people. Then came the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 AD, and in those 2 years, a lot of the population died because of reasons like hunger. Times were difficult and a lot of crimes were also happening during this time. After that were the 100 Years' War, 1337 AD, in which England and France fight for the French throne. Then the Black Death comes in 1348 and ends in 1350 AD. This deadly disease wiped out half the population of Europe and caused death to a lot of people. Then came the Great Schism 1378 to 1417 AD, in which the church was divided into Eastern and Western Christian Church. And in 1453, the Ottoman Empire captures Constantinople, and this ends the Eastern Roman Empire called Byzantium. Then came the Renaissance, which ended the Middle Ages. The Renaissance started in Florence, which was in Italy, around 1350 to 1400. The Renaissance started and ended in 1300 to 1600. In this period, there was a rebirth of European culture, art, politics and economy, and changed philosophy, literature and art completely, and brought new ways of thinking known as humanism. That's basically everything about the Middle Ages. Thanks for watching. Bye.